This book is the reason that most of you would have clicked on this video. This book is the reason we all know who George Orwell is. But most of us don't really know much about him, and we should. His life is a tale of brutality, violence, and self-hatred in India, followed by a shame-induced spiral into poverty, a slow redemption as he champions the corner of the working class, and finally, the culmination of all these experiences into his masterpiece, 1984, which didn't see widespread success until after Orwell died at the age of 43. In this video, I'll go over George Orwell's life and the key moments that shaped his thoughts, starting with his youth. This isn't a standard biography style video where I tell you every little detail about him. This is all about the events that shaped his thinking and ultimately his literature. Born in 1903, George Orwell was originally named Eric Arthur Blair. Orwell is actually just a pen name, which we'll get to later. Until then, we'll call him Blair. Although originally born in India to a middle-class British family, he would receive the majority of his upbringing and education in England. One way or another though, he would find himself back in South Asia. It's also important to note that since he was a child, Blair had always had problems with his lungs, and throughout his life his struggle with health would be a debilitating factor. Anyway, at the very beginning, he would study at St Cyprian's, although later he would find himself at Eton College, where he immediately struggled to fit in with the other, much wealthier, privileged students. Blair immediately built a reputation as a firebrand and an articulate speaker with a disdain for authority. In his early years at school, he would wet the bed by accident and receive physical punishment for doing so. One of his headmasters was quoted as saying that he was extremely argumentative, and one of his tutors by the name of Gow said that he was an unattractive kid and a nuisance, which is true. He was a massive prankster and was expelled from one school for sending a dead rat to the town surveyor as a birthday present. Despite his troubled relationship with authority, however, at school, Blair would learn to argue and would learn to distrust privilege and wealth. But it wouldn't take him long to cozy up to a new kind of authority, the British Empire. At the age of 19, Blair set sail for India to join the colonial police force, where he would eventually hold a position of responsibility, governing over 200,000 people. This was Orwell's first brush with tyranny, and he despised it. His frustrations can be seen in his first novel, Burmese Days, in which he describes the cynical, racist and exploitative nature of British imperialism in the East, and that the consequences of time spent as an imperialist were fundamentally corrupting to all the parties involved. It was his first intellectual awakening. For the rest of his life, he'd be an anti-imperialist, even if he would continue to participate in colonialism to make his own ends meet. And although it's important to remember that Blair was part of the imperial machine, he did try his best to appreciate Burmese culture within the constraints of his professional duties, and he learnt to speak fluent Burmese, as well as writing sentimentally about local culture, food, and nature. Eventually, however, he was charged with the responsibility of hanging a Burmese man, which was a breaking point for him. He wrote of his experiences, "I saw the mystery, the unspeakable wrongness of cutting a life short when it is in full tide. This man was not dying. He was alive, just as we were alive. He and we were a party of men, walking together, seeing, hearing, feeling, understanding the same world. And in 2 minutes, with a sudden snap, one of us would be gone. One mind less, one world less." After witnessing the execution, he was unable to square his conscience with his profession, and in 1928 he resigned from the colonial police force. His plan was to go to Paris and become an author. Blair's first attempt to make money writing was an abject failure. He found himself completely broke, and despite having an education from Eton, he was reduced to washing dishes as a plongeur in a Parisian hotel. It was here that he rubbed shoulders with the underclass of European society, learned to speak French, and had his eyes opened to the extreme poverty that characterised the average life during the interwar years. It was Blair's second intellectual realisation, that the poor are not poor because of any individual character fault, but solely due to misfortune and circumstance. To get by, Blair would sell all of his possessions down to his last set of clothes and work grueling 16-hour shifts, sweating in the dingy kitchens of Paris, continually shocked that this was the standard of life for the majority of Europeans. After this experience, he said he would never enjoy a meal in a posh restaurant again, writing, "Generally, the more you are obliged to pay for a meal, the more sweat and spittle you are obliged to eat with it." After months of hard labour in Paris, Blair decided to escape to London, where he imagined he might have better fortunes. He was wrong. In London, he went from employed but poor to unemployed and homeless, and once again became radicalised by the conditions of the poor in Britain. At that time, the homeless were required to stay in something called the Spike, a makeshift accommodation to keep the homeless for a night before forcing them to move on. Conditions were brutal. Routine lice checks, which required being naked in large groups, sleeping on the floor of freezing cold rooms alongside people sick with infectious diseases, and a routine battle against hunger and rotten food. This stint of abject poverty was a positive change for Blair's life though, and he recounted his experiences in a book called Down and Out in Paris and London. Here's a quote. "The worst thing about being homeless is the feeling of shame and the perpetual dread of being degraded. A man who has lived long enough in poverty becomes not only a pitiful, but a repulsive object. His body degraded, and the mind follows suit." This striking, warts and all writing style earned him a chance to make a living as a writer, and the book was published. Before publishing, however, Blair was concerned that the graphic details in the book would embarrass his family, so he adopted a pen name, George Orwell. The book was a modest hit, and he was commissioned by a socialist book club to write a new book on the circumstances of the working class in northern England. What he saw in the north of England would haunt him. He spends a good chunk of the book just detailing the fate of renters and their squalid houses. He explains how their diet of tinned food, white bread and fake butter had led to a degeneration in public health, and how the back-breaking labour of the miners was so woefully underappreciated. It's a really depressing and sometimes boring read because he spares no detail, but we can see that the book helped to galvanise Orwell into a more radical stance. Orwell had actually thrown himself down into a mine at one point for the book, and this had exacerbated his health problems to the point at which he'd be bedbound for days in order to recover. But this moment of reflection was a chance for him to distill his experiences. He had seen and hated imperialism in Asia, and now he had seen and hated poverty in Europe. From now on, he would do anything he could to further the interests of the working class, despite his Eton education and despite now being a modestly successful writer. It didn't take long for Orwell to find his chances to fight for the working class. In the summer of 1936, a civil war broke out in Spain. On one side, the nationalist forces of Francisco Franco, and on the other, a coalition of socialist and communist parties. Orwell, having had some military experience in Burma, was up for it, and he signed up to fight on behalf of the workers. He arrived in Barcelona in December of 1936 and was immediately charmed by the array of political diversity and the democratic spirit in Barcelona. Here was a city run by and for the working class. He'd made the right decision. This was something worth fighting to protect. And fight he would. He was sent to the Aragon front, where he would spend 4 months fighting under a socialist brigade against the Spanish fascists. This would be relatively uneventful, with one minor engagement. Eventually, however, he returned from the Aragon front and found Barcelona a very different place. Before, it had been a relatively democratic but unified hodgepodge of left-leaning organisations fighting for a common purpose: the end of fascism and tyranny in Spain. Now, however, Barcelona was a city at its own throat, as the communists had, as Orwell saw it, essentially hijacked the workers' movement in an attempt to establish a Stalinist-style regime in Spain. Since Orwell was a socialist, not a Stalinist, he was a target of the new communist coup and was publicly labelled a fascist. He would have to hide on a roof for a number of days before returning to the Aragon front again to fight amongst his socialist comrades. His misfortune followed him to Aragon though, because shortly after returning to the front line, he was shot in the throat by a sniper. It missed his artery, his spine, and his windpipe by mere millimetres. It was by all accounts a miracle that he survived. Although left with a permanent rasp to his voice and a powerful knock to his already fragile health. Orwell writes, "The whole experience of being hit by a bullet is very interesting, and I think it is worth describing in detail. Roughly speaking, it was the sensation of being at the centre of an explosion. There was no pain, only a violent shock, such as you get from an electric terminal. With it, a sense of utter weakness, a feeling of being stricken and shriveled up to nothing." After his injury, Orwell left Spain, but he had taken with him another major development in his thought. Communism was bad. Now, it's not that Orwell had abandoned his working class sensibilities. He was still staunchly on the left, perhaps what we might call now somewhere between a socialist and a social democrat. But what he had seen in Spain was that Stalin's brand of communism was fundamentally totalitarian, with no regard for the truth and no real care for furthering the interests of the workers. This made him immensely unpopular within his social and professional circles, and apart from his relationship with his wife, he would struggle to find others with whom he could freely share his ideas without staunch criticism. Although today we see Orwell as a man for all sides, by the late 1930s he was a lone voice, too far to the left for the conservatives and too critical of Stalinism for the leftists. But then the Second World War started. Orwell suddenly found a new fight, and a new political home amongst the pro-war camp in the UK. Since Orwell despised fascism as much as Stalinism, he was comfortable galvanising public opinion in favour of resisting Hitler. He was desperate to fight again, like he had in Spain, but on account of his injury and his worsening tuberculosis, the army wouldn't take him. Orwell later complained that although his health had always been a problem, it hadn't stopped him from doing anything he wanted, except for fighting in the war. Although the army wouldn't have him, the BBC would, and by 1941, Orwell found his way to contribute to the war effort as a reporter for the BBC's Eastern Network, reporting to and on the developments of war across the globe. It was essentially a propaganda job, and he quickly came to resent his newfound role, as well as his office at the BBC, Room 101. In 1943, just 2 years later, he resigned without much fuss and cleared his conscience by returning to the truth and started writing Animal Farm. It's a scathing poke at Soviet politics, and although it squared comfortably with Orwell's political views, it made a lot of his peers very upset. By the book's release in 1945, Britain and the US had been working closely with the USSR to defeat Nazi Germany, and since Russia was now an ally, it was unwise to start poking the bear with this kind of critique and satire. The reception was, for all intents and purposes, cold. He had no idea that he'd just written a piece of work that would come to be on everyone's bookshelf within a few decades. It was after publishing Animal Farm that George Orwell's health began to decline, along with his public reputation. And with that 1-2 punch, he more or less withdrew from public life and began to work on his masterpiece, 1984. Undeterred by the shaky reception of Animal Farm, Orwell retreated to the island of Jura to focus on a new book. For this new venture, he would draw on all of his experiences throughout his life. It would all be useful. His intricate understanding of power through his experiences in Burma, his knowledge of Dickensian poverty from his time as a tramp in London, his exposure to Stalinist and fascist totalitarianism from the Spanish Civil War, and 6 brutal years of fighting in the Second World War. And lastly, his practice in propaganda, where he was forced to compromise on the truth when working for the wartime BBC. And so, for 3 years, between 1946 and 1949, George Orwell was in a race against his failing health, to complete the finest work of his life, before his life was over. It was there he laid in bed for weeks on end, choking and spluttering through failing lungs, as he tried to distill a lifetime of experiences and truth into a 342-page warning to the world. It worked. George Orwell successfully completed 1984, and it remains today one of the most read books of all time. It gives us the language to define oppression with Big Brother, Doublethink, Newspeak, Thought Crime, 101 and The Thought Police. It's a haunting vision of a future in which Stalinist-style rule is combined with modern technology to create a world in which there's no freedom, no private life, no rights, extreme poverty, extreme violence, and an existence of complete and utter depression, fear, despair, paranoia, and hopelessness. It was his warning to the world. It took a lifetime of experiences, hard-earned lessons, and political meditation to bring this together. Orwell gave everything to this book. Literally, he prioritized its completion over his own health, which is why within 6 months of publishing 1984, he died of tuberculosis, a disease of poverty, at the age of 43. Orwell did manage to get a glimpse of his success, but between his ill health and the few months he was alive for its publishing, he was never able to fully grasp the success of the book and the influence it would come to have on thinkers around the world right up until today, nearly a full century later.